A good villain is as good fantasy as elves and dwarves, as magic and tall towers, as kings and queens, and as knights and dragons. While not every single fantasy has a big baddie, many do. Villains are a valuable source of conflict in many fantasy stories, but writing effective and memorable villains can be challenging. Think of all the villains you've read or seen across all mediums of storytelling and consider which ones you loved, which ones captured your attention and interest, and then compare that to the villains that left little to no impression or even irritated you, and not in a I love to hate them way, if you can even remember them specifically. What makes some villains work and others fall flat? Hello and welcome to the Book Bin, or welcome back if you're a returning guest. I'm Conor Barlow, and today we'll be diving into villains, what makes them compelling, fun, and memorable for your readers, and how to write them. We'll cover things to consider when designing your villain, and what you need to keep in mind while writing them. But before we can discuss how to write a good villain, let's actually figure out what makes a good villain, and some examples to help you as a sort of template, not to copy, but to refer to when aiming for a specific kind of villain. All good villains can be broken down into specific aspects that they fulfill that let them shine. The villains aren't entirely defined by those pieces, keep in mind, and many of them will operate and make choices beyond those, as good villains aren't cookie cutter, but we can still analyze these features and figure out common traits, characteristics, and functions to help us write our own villains. After all, the best writing advice that I stand by is, you have to learn the rules in order to break them. There's one thing you should know before you begin to design your villain. The first question you should be able to answer is not necessarily what is a villain, but instead, what is the difference between an antagonist and a villain? The difference can be summarized like this. Antagonists are forces that block protagonists from achieving their goals. Antagonists come in many shapes and sizes. Villains are a specific type of antagonist and generally fall into the person versus person type of conflict, with exceptions. You may be asking, wait, there's types of conflicts? And yes, there are. Let's quickly review the types of conflict. If you already know, it may still be helpful to refresh. While we review, I'll make sure to point out where villains can occur, as there are a few conflict styles that villains can appear in. Person versus person. This conflict occurs when the protagonist is in conflict with another character, also known as the antagonist. The antagonist tries to stop the protagonist in some way from achieving their goal. This is the primary type of conflict villains appear. Actually, it's always present when villains are in the picture, regardless of if another conflict style appears. Person versus self. This is an internal conflict. Protagonists facing this conflict style are struggling with themselves and their shortcomings, flaws, and insecurities, all of which make it difficult for the protagonist to achieve their goal. Person versus nature. This conflict style involves the protagonist trying to survive against the natural elements and the natural world. These are often survival stories in which the protagonist is simply trying to stay alive, then maybe thrive, in the wilderness or a natural environment that requires effort to survive in. Person versus society. This is the first conflict style that can directly synchronize with the person versus person conflict style. On its own, this conflict style consists of the protagonist trying to achieve goals that are in direct opposition to societal norms, customs, and expectations. The protagonist challenges what is acceptable, and society may try to stop or even punish them. Oftentimes, society is represented by a composite character, an antagonist who represents society and has direct authority to enact those punishments and restrictions on the protagonist, thus tying the story to a person versus person conflict style in addition to the person versus society style. Person versus technology. This is the second conflict style that can directly synchronize with the person versus person conflict style. On its own, this conflict style involves machines and technology. This is a relatively new conflict style, not that it hasn't existed for a long time, but I think it's only really been acknowledged recently as an official conflict style, at least that I'm familiar with that happening. These stories involve protagonists being at odds with machines that are emotionless, entirely logical and number-driven, and often devoid of emotion or soul and the human condition. It's not unusual for these stories to have robots or AI that is entirely or partially sentient, which is where it can synchronize with the person versus person conflict style by making a composite character machine. Person versus God, fate, or the supernatural. This conflict style has gone by many names, but it has a centrally shared theme, and it is also the third style conflict that can directly synchronize with the person versus person conflict style. The protagonist of this style faces either a literal or metaphorical supernatural force in their lives. If it's metaphorical, you can think of it being like, is it my destiny to do X, but I want to do Y? Or, it feels like whenever I try to achieve my goal, luck has a funny way of failing me. If it's literal, there may be a room for a person versus person style conflict to synchronize, with deities in opposition to the protagonists, ghosts or ghouls, or supernatural creatures. I could probably deep dive into each of these conflict styles and their pros and cons, what to consider, some examples, and so on, but we're just focused on villains right now. The reason we reviewed them is to help make things clear for you as you get into planning and designing villains. Villains exist in a person versus person conflict style, but they can work well alongside other conflict styles as well. Figure out what conflict style your story calls for and if a villain is necessary or can synchronize with it. Additionally, don't worry if you have multiple conflict styles. Many stories incorporate several conflict styles. What matters most is balancing them all and ensuring each receives a satisfying and complete conclusion. So now we know. Villains are a person versus person conflict style antagonist. But what else is a villain? The answer can be boiled down to something fairly simple. Villains are antagonists who are willing to, and do, cross moral lines. While all antagonists are barriers and sources of conflict for our protagonist, not all antagonists are actually bad people who want to harm others. Villains, however, are antagonists who specifically cross those lines and do things that would be considered unacceptable to stop the protagonist or to achieve their own goals. Good villains don't all look alike. If all villains were exactly the same, then writing villains would be incredibly boring and none would stand out in your mind, even if some were well written. Villains can be categorized by a series of archetypes, each with common traits that you will see across many villains who fulfill the archetype. So let's go over what those archetypes are and consider an example. Keep in mind I might spoil a few things when providing examples, but I won't go into a ton of detail. That said, you've been warned. Number 1, the anti-villain. Anti-villains are bad people with sympathetic motivations or appealing characteristics. They're a mirror version of anti-heroes who are good people prone to performing immoral or evil acts in order to accomplish a good goal. Anti-villains may do morally good things, virtuous things, but their ultimate goal is to perform evil in the long term. An example of an anti-villain is Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs. At the start of the plot, he's imprisoned and he helps Clarice in her case. This is a noble, good thing to do, using his understanding of criminality to help her apprehend a serial killer. But you know, if you've read or watched this story, that Hannibal is not doing this out of the kindness of his own heart. Instead, he uses his help to bargain for better accommodations, then he uses that as an opportunity to kill and escape, usurping Buffalo Bill's role as the antagonist. Number 2, the Beast. The Beast is a simple villain with a simple goal: defeat the protagonist and fulfill their own needs. The Beast archetype is typically a literal monster, creature, or dangerous animal. A key trait of the Beast is that it cannot be negotiated or reasoned with. So driven by their own innate needs or desires, it will be entirely singular on achieving that goal. An example of the Beast would be the shark from Jaws, a beast whose goal is only to consume and feed its hunger. One cannot speak to sharks or try to convince it to stop. It will continue to fulfill its needs unless the protagonists can end it. Number 3, the Bully. The Bully is an interesting villain, as it's one that most everyone would be able to pull real-life experience from while writing. The Bully can be defined by their aggression and control over others. They rely on fear, physical force, or social standing to lift themselves above others. They fear losing their control and power over others and are relatively singular in the desire to maintain their status. Some bully villains are entirely cruel for the sake of being cruel, while others may have a backstory that provides an explanation for their behavior, or even make them sympathetic, such as an abusive childhood or personal insecurity. Sometimes bullies are redeemed depending on how the author wants to approach this archetype. An example of the bully would be Biff Tannen from the Back to the Future series. Biff is just a cruel person who has always been cruel to the McFly family across decades, both toward the father and son, and has a disgusting and immature attitude that also operates as a bully toward the mother. There is a brief moment in the second movie in which one sees where Biff lived as a teenager, and a lot of things click into place about why he is the way he is. Number 4, the Machine. The Machine is exactly what it sounds like, and it's similar to the Beast archetype, albeit with its own nuances. The machine is a technological construct incapable of feeling pain, fear, or emotion. The machine is singular in its goals and runs entirely on its understanding of logic to achieve its goals and stop the protagonist. Sometimes the machine can be reasoned with, but it's a hard bargain and requires a lot of logical thought to accomplish, as any appeal to emotion or humanity will fail. An example of the machine is the Terminator from the titular series, as cliché an example that might be. Still, the Terminator is iconic in how singularly he operates, his entire focus on finding and killing Sarah Connor. Even when blown up, his broken pieces still try to pursue her, displaying how the machine archetype knows nothing other than completing its goals. Number 5. The Mastermind. Masterminds are intellectual villains who oppose the protagonists with logic instead of sheer physical force. Masterminds aren't necessarily weaklings afraid to get into a physical altercation, but those altercations are a part of intricate plans, not just a big slab of meat trying to use violence to win every scenario. Masterminds oversee master plans and make schemes in the shadows. They want to defeat the protagonist, not just physically, but mentally as well. An example of the mastermind is Ben Linus from Lost, at least prior to his shift into an anti-hero in later seasons. Ben is shown to manipulate the other survivors, kidnap Michael's son to use as a bargaining chip to get what he wants, then uses other survivors as further bargaining chips against Jack to get the surgery he needs to survive. His schemes get him exactly who he needs and what he wants, even when he's in a vulnerable position with Jack, who must perform a surgery that could kill him if Jack so chose. Number 6. Evil Incarnate. Evil Incarnate is, quite literally, a personification of evil itself. This archetype provides very little backstory or character development, and like a few of the other archetypes, is fairly singular and direct with their purpose or goal. Evil Incarnate is often harsh and brutal and lacks any compassionate or humane qualities. Like the Beast or Machine, this type cannot be reasoned with. An example of Evil Incarnate would be Pyramid Head from Silent Hill 2. Pyramid Head is a dangerous presence throughout Silent Hill 2, but he is a manifestation of James Sunderland's guilt. Pyramid Head's goal is to make James remember by distributing justice in his own corrupted, evil way. In future iterations, Pyramid Head gains an expanded role as a general agent of dark, grueling, and twisted justice. Number 7. The Henchman. The Henchman is an archetype that is associated with villains who perform the dirty work of others. These villains are typically side villains or sidekicks to the main villain. Each henchman may have their own individual goals and motives, but at some point they identified that the villain they help is their best way to achieve those goals. An example of the henchman is Mike Ehrmantraut in Breaking Bad. Mike is a man who wants to take care of his family and provide for them. At some point in his life, he meets Gus Fring and gets entangled in his drug operation, but decides that ultimately it's the best solution to his problem. Do the dirty work for Gus, get paid, provide for his family just like he wants. He does everything in his power to protect this operation, even at the cost of his own life and the lives of others. Number 8. The Fanatic. The Fanatic is a villain driven by extreme ideology, often religious in nature, or a twisting of moral beliefs, though there are exceptions. This fixation on extreme ideological beliefs and values drive the Fanatic to carry out what they see as a sacred or moral mission, a responsibility that they bear. They are prone to elaborate symbolism, preaching, and grandstanding. An example of the Fanatic is the serial killer John Doe from the movie Seven, whose murders are fueled by religious ideas surrounding the 7 deadly sins. In the movie, John Doe explains that he believes God chose him to send a message to society about the dangers of sin and society's apathy toward it, and he believes each murder, which he stages and marks with the sins gluttony, greed, sloth, lust, and pride. Envy and wrath are covered later in the movie, but those are very important to the plot, so I won't spoil it. There are plenty of other archetypes or even subtypes within these, but I wanted to share the ones I believe are the most common, most flexible, and most integral. In researching villain archetypes, each of these appeared in some form more than once. When you're designing your villain, use these archetypes as a guideline. Don't force yourself to fit into a box. If you want a fanatic archetype villain, but also want them to be an anti-villain, you can mix and match and find characteristics and traits that work together and don't. A lot of the good villains described in the examples for each are often great because they actually aren't bound by their archetype. Perhaps they fit multiple, or at the very least have traits that aren't exclusive to the archetype they represent the most. By using archetypes for inspiration and framework, then moving beyond it as your villain develops, you give your audience a familiar foundation that they can latch onto so that they can more easily follow you when you branch beyond it. With these archetypes laid out alongside some examples of good villains who can represent them, we can now explore how effective writing makes a good villain, and what areas you can focus on in your writing to make a villain that will stick with your audience. There are 3 key areas that you should pay close attention to when designing and writing your villain, and we'll discuss them now. As we go over them, think back on some of our examples of good villains, and you'll see that either all of these elements are present, or at least a couple of them are. A vital piece of both your character design and writing to make an interesting character is by maintaining their sense of humanity for the audience to see and feel. Now, that doesn't need to be literal humanity, as our archetypes have examples of machines, monsters, and beasts. The goal of showing your villains humanity is to explore their complexity and flesh them out beyond the basic archetype or one dimension. This focuses more on the moral realm, the balance of good and evil, and more. Take the time to explore the moral beliefs and compass of your villain. With the exception of certain archetypes, villains should not have every single thing they say or do be unambiguously evil. It's okay and can even be compelling to your audience if they can understand your villain's logic or aspects of their moral beliefs, or maybe even in some ways they might agree with the villain's beliefs, but not their methods or how extreme it becomes. You want villains to have strong moral codes and ethics, a compass that audiences can identify and that you can use as a guideline for consistency. The villain's goals should be well thought out and fit within this moral code. They should want to succeed at something that makes sense for who they are and what they believe about the world, the situation, or whatever your story is focused on. From the character's perspective, their every decision should be able to fit logically within this moral code, or, if they step outside of it, creates clarity in how their moral beliefs have changed. Villains should be able to use their own logical reasoning to justify or explain their actions, and why it would be morally acceptable given their goal. After all, most people don't see themselves as evil, but as good people trying to do the right thing. By giving your villain a strong moral code, your audience can understand them better, see where they choose to show restraint or even compassion, and may even feel discomfort, in a good way, if they find they agree with aspects of that villain's reasoning. A key way to show these logical moral codes is by showing a time that the villain is gentle, performs an act of good, or displays some kind of vulnerability. Again, it's not realistic for a villain's every action to be in service of an evil scheme. While evil for evil's sake can be fun, and there are archetypes for it, it can also sometimes be flat and can make a villain come across as a bit bland and more like an obstacle to deal with than a real individual with strong oppositional force, depending on the story. By showing what they care about, what weaknesses they may have, and what their background is, you can help shape them in the eyes of your audience and make the reasoning they do what they do feel like an inevitability of who they are, rather than because the plot demanded a villain do something bad. Your goal isn't necessarily to try to redeem your villain or even make them sympathetic while you do this, by the way. Rather, your goal is just to expose more complex layers of the character and lay out a consistent set of traits and beliefs so you can really delve into their nature and psyche up close. All of this can culminate then into what makes them truly villainous on a much more personal and intimate level. When you see their beliefs, what shaped them, and how they operate within that code, you can then examine what your villain is willing to sacrifice to achieve their goal, what it costs them to actually do what they set out to do. What did this character have to lose to get where they are? What are they prepared to lose in order to succeed? The more personal and closer to the villain this answer gets, the more your audience will see their conviction. By exploring the moral and human aspects of your villains, you're going to find ways to interweave your themes and ideas into the villain's logic and writing, and make more compelling arcs. You'll also be able to make characters that feel consistent and are unquestionable in terms of decision-making to your readers. Even if they disagree or dislike the villain as a person, seeing them as well-rounded and logical characters will make it easier for those same readers to invest in and believe as a legitimate force opposing your protagonist. Exploring your villain's humanity and morality will help you identify key themes or interweave your story's themes into the villains themselves, which will elevate your villain's presence on the page. The quickest way to ruin a villain is to make their actions entirely illogical and unnecessary, which might frustrate or bore the audience. Love him or hate him, think he's well written or think he's terrible, but a good example of this from popular media is actually Thanos. After all, one of the biggest debates about him being well written, or whether he's not, isn't actually discussing the writing of his character, but on if he was right or wrong ethically. I would say that's a sign of pretty good writing, that people argue about his moral code, which he operates within consistently. In addition, in Infinity War, his killing Gamora is a sign of exactly what he's willing to lose. Something he himself claims to be dear to him, showing that even someone he claims to love and value is not important enough over his ideology and goal. He has a sincere and earnest belief in his cause and is willing to sacrifice the closest person in his life, the only person who could have offered him a semblance of redemption. Regardless of if you like Marvel movies or not, I don't. This is some pretty interesting stuff and has made Thanos a pretty memorable character in pop culture that is highly likely to stand the test of time. Before I talk about the next writing tip, let me go on a tangent. I thought about making this its own writing tip, but it didn't feel right on its own. It's more of a continuation or side note on humanity and morality. Some of the best villains are ones who are just fun, or have interesting personalities or charm. This unfortunately just takes practice writing to get better at. It's hard to think of ways to invoke charm in a character, but once you know their moral compass, their goal, and where they have limits they will or won't cross, you can probably think of examples of people you've met or characters you've seen that are similar and figure out how you're drawn to them. There's no one right way for a villain's personality to be, but it'll be helpful to ensure that their personalities line up well with who they are as people and what they believe. This next section could be seen as a step 2, if showing your villain's humanity was a part of your focus. Once you know your character's moral compass and what they're willing to do to accomplish their goals, you have to give them the agency to actually work toward those goals. The easiest way to kill any interest or appreciation for a villain is to make them powerless. Good villains don't just sit there twiddling their thumbs, waiting for the hero to make their appearance to put their plans into action. A competent threat that can and does win is more compelling than a villain who can never seem to beat the hero in any situation. The phrase, "you may have lost the battle but not the war," is a very important saying for heroes to keep in mind in stories, and the mirror should be applied to a villain. You may have won the battle but not the war. A way you can make this more effective is by tying what the villain is willing to lose to their winning. If they win but at a great loss, this can raise the stakes by pushing the villain to greater extremes. A good example of this is Handsome Jack in Borderlands 2. It's all fun and games, he's threatening you, but also making fun of you and treating it like a fun pastime as he works against you, until you find and kill Angel, his only child, the thing he cherishes the most. Jack's entire tone changes after this, and he takes direct action in a way he hasn't before, that makes the situation far more dire than it was prior. In the end, he won the encounter. He kills an important figure and kidnaps another to continue his plans, leaving you, the player, with less resources than when you went after Angel. But now Handsome Jack has lost the only thing he cares about besides himself. This unlocks any of the danger he would have held back and propelled his grandiose sense of heroism to the extremes, because now it's personal. He was certainly a threat before, but now, you feel lucky to get out in one piece when you cross him. The last area that you want to put some attention on would be by establishing a connection between your hero and villain. This can often make or break a good villain in a story. When a villain has a close connection to your hero, it inherently raises the stakes and allows for there to be personal investment by the characters and/or the audience. What do we mean by connection? Is that prior history or relationships? Are they related? Did something drive them apart? All of those could be options, but the connection can really vary, and you're not bound to any one method. So long as there is connection, there will be grounds to explore the villain and hero on a deeper level. A literal plot connection isn't a requirement, though. You can connect the characters based on literary qualities as well, which we'll elaborate on in a moment. In general, there are 4 primary ways that you can connect your villain and your hero. Number 1. Intertwine the character's fates. This can be done in a lot of different ways. For example, you could have an actual prophecy that links them, or perhaps the goals of each character are polar opposites on a large scale, so they were always destined to fight. There's many ways you can tie their fates together. Is it clear that only one of them can live for the world to be at peace? Does the villain need something from the hero to achieve their goals and nobody else could possibly give them what they need? Explore your options and how they can be linked. While I'm not a huge fan of the series for a lot of reasons, a good example of this would be Harry Potter and the many ways that he and Voldemort are inherently bound to one another. The biggest and the most obvious example being the Scar and Harry's nature as a Horcrux. These two are intertwined by their own bodies and spirits, and to defeat the villain, one must make deadly sacrifices to win. Number 2. Give a personal relationship to the characters. By making them know each other, you can really play with how they interact, and the different types of relationships can entirely alter the course of a story and change the stakes for your audience. A really good example of this, I'd say, is the classic Darth Vader revealing that he's Luke's father. Think about it, we already knew Darth Vader was a dangerous person, and our investment as audience members to Luke's battle made us want for him to succeed. And then this twist is revealed, and it flips the entire story on its head. You feel the devastation of such knowledge. You feel for Luke's inner conflict at who he faces as an enemy, and how difficult it must be to reconcile with this knowledge. It changes their interactions, their goals, their motivations, and what even the audience wants to see in the resolution. Number 3. Consider the way your villain interacts with your hero, both with any prior history in mind and in general regardless. How does the villain embody the conflict, both inside and out, in the eyes of your hero? When a villain is involved in the story, how does conflict come as a result of the hero and villain interacting? What consequences does their interaction bring to those around them or to the world at large? Think of how wildly different some hero and villain dynamics are. The way Batman and the Joker interact and how it impacts others around them looks entirely different from the way Agent Smith and Neo's interactions impact others in the world. Number 4. Reflect the hero in your villain and vice versa. This is a strong literary tool that I would recommend trying to explore and implement in almost any work you write with a villain and hero dynamic at play. While there may be situations where it doesn't work, more often than not you'll find ways to play with your story's theme in both characters. Ways to explore this include having both characters plagued by the same question or fear and showing how differently it shapes them. Perhaps they share similar beliefs or flaws, or perhaps the villain reminds the hero of a way they once were, or could have been had they not chosen a different path in life. There are plenty of options. A rather iconic example of this would be Gollum's reflection of Frodo in Lord of the Rings. Think of it like this. Gollum was once a hobbit himself, but became so corrupted by the ring that it transformed him into a monstrous creature. It tore apart his life, and he killed his own family member to get the ring, a reflection of Frodo and Sam's relationship, and now still seeks the ring desperately to get it back. Gollum is a warning to Frodo and to the audience of what Frodo risks becoming if he cannot relinquish the ring when it's time, or if he does not complete his quest. There's obviously many other things to consider when writing villains, but I thought I'd cover these ones, as they're common areas that writers might struggle with or forget to really put some thought and consideration into. Remember, there's no one right way to do these things, and not all of them even have to be present. You should take the time to consider each and compare it to your project and ideas, but don't necessarily feel like you have to use any of these. Be intentional about what you do and don't include in your writing, and make sure you have good reasoning that you feel confident in as you do. Before we close out, I thought I'd quick share a couple examples of villains that I found do a good job at fumbling a lot of the ideas that we established over this video. Keep in mind these are my subjective picks. If you disagree and think they're good villains, that's totally fine. I just want to give you an idea of where I see problems to actually help you critically analyze your own work. The first example I thought of almost immediately for villains who really missed the mark in terms of writing were the Calypso twins in Borderlands 3. There's many reasons for this, but let me use some of the topics we discussed to highlight what problems they had. First, I don't think there was very much exploration into their humanity or moral compass. They were bad guys just trying to be bad guys, and their motivation for their villainy are kind of shallow and not that clear. They started a cult because they wanted to be famous, I guess. Why they decided they wanted to be murderous, rampaging monsters is kind of lost on me, to be honest. I don't think the game ever really gave a strong reason as to why they went that route. We also don't see any complexity to them. They livestream their evil deeds and butt heads as siblings and make dated jokes that were a little embarrassing to hear when it first came out. Regardless, while their background is explored and where they come from, it was a little confusing to me how they got from where they were to who they became as antagonists, morally speaking. In terms of agency, the twins are complicated in that. They technically have agency, and there's times when they do flex that, though often in ways that feel disrespectful to legacy characters like Maya. But one thing that falters is how muddy their influence actually is. Think of it like this. In Borderlands 2, it's always very clear which enemies are from Hyperion, the company that Handsome Jack runs. You come across them more and more and find bigger and bigger facilities and construction projects. But you can always tell which enemies are Hyperion and which enemies are just the generic bandits of the world. It helps shape Handsome Jack's influence and reach. In contrast, there's multiple planets in Borderlands 3 and multiple variations of enemies, and I guess the twins control all of them? It's kind of unclear. And all these enemy types on one planet tend to blend together. While there are some scenes that can show off the twins' capability, their actual agency throughout the bulk of the game feels detached, and more like they're just waiting for you to show up. There was one section of the game where it looked like they were going to use the twins' agencies in an interesting way. It seemed like they were butting heads, and the story was hinting that they might actually choose to split and become two factions. It would have been interesting and made it so you could feel each person's influence and make the missions more complex. But they dropped and abandoned this plot thread quickly and nothing really came of it, which I found very disappointing. There's also the fumbling with making any real connection to the player characters in a way that's satisfying. At first, they kind of just exist there. They just do their thing and start to go after you because you're, I guess, a nuisance. It's not super clear early on to my recollection. And I remember feeling pretty disconnected from the conflict with their cult. Eventually they show up and cause some real damage, and namely, they find ways to connect the player to the twins as villains by going after legacy characters like Lilith and Maya, but there's not really a mutual exchange to cause this, and so instead of making a compelling player versus villain relationship, it's more just the players developing a dislike for villains who practically stop existing the moment they're off screen. Once again, in contrast, at first Handsome Jack is just a guy who talks your ear off through a large portion of the game, whose presence on Pandora slowly creeps to the forefront but can stay somewhat in the background for quite some time. Then you go to deal with Angel and you learn the connection she has to Jack, and then it culminates. You take something from him, and he responds by taking two things from you, Roland and Lilith both. There is an exchange, and each of you have now lost something dear to you, and now you both want revenge. It becomes a mutual feeling between the player and the villain, and now these two groups are bound by fate. Only one can survive this conflict. It's not just business, it's personal. Getting to the vault isn't about riches anymore, it's about control, vengeance, and justice. You never get that with the twins. They kill and hurt your own, but nothing brings them close to you, to actually connect you in a way that raises the stakes. Another example of a disappointing villain, but in a very different way, is the sheriff from the short story Baraska, the main character's father. Without getting too into it and spoiling a lot, I'm actually talking not about the main story, but rather the change in the sheriff between the main story and the bonus chapter. Now, villains don't need to be bound to one archetype. They can take up multiple, or even flow between archetypes over time, especially the longer time goes on. The thing the writer needs to keep in mind, however, is that this process into change needs to flow and feel natural to the reader. The sheriff in the story has done some awful things, and in the main story he fulfills each of the main areas well. He has a clearly defined moral compass by the end, he has agency to do what he does, and he has a personal connection to our protagonist as his father and as an important member of the community. He works pretty well in the main story, and there's a lot of emotional depth and pain between him and his son. But then you get to the bonus chapter. While people can change, I found that all of the nuance that made the sheriff so dark and grim, so foul and terrible, was completely absent. He'd moved from a very complex individual doing terrible things in his community to practically a mafioso with no conflicting emotions about his actions, no real regrets, and wanting to harm his son, which he'd never wanted to do in the main story. I'm purposely being vague because even if you know the sheriff isn't a good guy, the story is just a big mystery, and I don't want to take that away from anyone who hasn't read it or listened to the podcast or I think the show. I don't remember if they were doing a show or not. For those who know it though, they probably know what I'm talking about. This is an example of how archetypes and exploring a character's moral compass go hand in hand. Having a villain have a completely different personality is such a whiplash that makes them feel like an entirely different entity. And it can be impossible for a reader to see how they went from point A villainy to point B villainy. Those two levels of villainy aren't necessarily more or less evil, but rather their mentality, beliefs, and moral boundaries are suddenly different with no explanation. Or there's even completely altered characteristics and traits that are so different, and we don't have any reason why those changes have occurred. It's an easy trap to fall into, to not guide your audience on the villain's journey from point A to B, but it's absolutely vital to do so, because otherwise it feels like a betrayal of the character when they act so outside of what the audience has become familiar with. I'd recommend you take some time to dissect and analyze villains you like and dislike both, and compare those villains to some of what we talked about in this video. It may help you identify what went well with some and what went wrong with others. This can then help you to look critically at your own villains and spot any potential issues to fix or find good qualities you want to emphasize. To wrap up, let's quickly review everything we've covered since it's quite a lot. First, we defined what a villain is. A villain is an antagonist that crosses moral boundaries, and that villains operate predominantly in the person versus person conflict style. We then discussed different types of villains to give you an example of how very different villains can be. That there's no one type of perfectly written villain, as there are many archetypes that are all iconic in their own ways. These archetypes were the anti-villain, the beast, the bully, the machine, the mastermind, evil incarnate, the henchman, and the fanatic. This was not a complete list, and they're not strict boxes that your villains must be in. They're simply guidelines that can help you develop a villain if you're looking for a villain who can perform a specific function. After that, we focused on 3 core areas to really pay attention to when developing your villain that can really impact the quality of your villain: their humanity and morality, their agency, and their connection to the hero. Finally, we discussed a couple of examples of how villains can fail to leave their mark on a story when these many areas of villain design aren't thoughtfully developed. I hope you were able to get some knowledge that you can take away with to develop your own villains for your own stories. It's a bulky and complicated topic, but there are tools you can use to help make decisions you're happy and confident in. As always, there's a link in the description to my research. Please feel free to use it and peruse my notes, and use this video as a good starting point to conduct further research and keep learning more. Do you have any tips on how to write good villains? Feel free to share them in the comments below, or tell me in the comments about your own journey in writing villains. I'm interested to see what other writers are at in their own works. Well, as always, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you being here. Feel free to leave a like, subscribe, hype, whatever suits your fancy. Each of these helps the channel out quite a lot. Regardless, I'm grateful for your presence, and I hope to see you around the book bin in the future.